So,
I brought some stuff for snack.
oh, mashallah,
And one is the cookies are sugar-free,
mashallah.
but not carb-free. The French twist is, it's cinnamon, but they're puffed, so they're not.
Are you trying to penalize me for the Shakeology sugar thing?
I just have to be careful of those things.
Yeah, the only thing with the non-sugar is that the other ingredients that they put to sweeten it up sometimes can be worse than the sugars.
You have to be careful.
That's the one thing that really concerns me. And the thing is that product, Shakeology, is with the product called P90X.
Yes.
So that's a really intense
that's
routine.
it, yeah.
So you actually need some sugar to stay awake, literally.
And that's why I said, you know your body, you know how intense.
Yeah.
I'm not looking at pictures.
Right, yeah, I've been doing that, and yeah, it's literally, it really kills you.
Yeah. You have to be careful, but be careful of those things like the corn syrups and.
Yeah, absolutely.
Make your muscles flabby.
Yeah. Yes, very true. Did we fix that microphone thing, by the way? The document on the thing? I think we had fixed it, right? Oh, he showed Azizan, right? Yeah, he showed Azizan on Sunday. So.
Are you talking about connecting the gray one to the laptop?
Yes, so that the laptop speaker is not working. So Azizan learned it, but I think it's back to the other one.
Okay.
That's fine, we'll figure it out. So we'll get it documented. Let's just make sure sound is good. Testing, good. Okay. Sure. Okay, let's begin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah, wa ba'd. So, I have 0 brothers today, mashallah. It's like, so, I'm not sure exactly what's going on with them, but that's fine. So we have good news and bad news today. Perhaps 2 good news. So the bad news is that we don't have any slides, because I didn't have a chance to make the slides. So I think this is the first time. Inshallah, it will be the last time. The good news, first good news, is I'm not allowed to tell you what that good news is, but you're going to find out on Thursday. The second good news is we'll try to finish early today, hopefully by Isha, and then we can all just go home early. So that would be nice, right? So I think it can be realistically done. If we understand everything today, it shouldn't be too difficult. All right.
What if someone is not taking it from me?
You're gonna hear the good news is gonna be announced throughout IOC.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, inshallah. All right. So, okay. All right, let's begin. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today we're going to be talking about linguistic clarity. So if you remember in the introduction to this class, we talked a lot about how language is ambiguous by nature, and one of the reasons why we really have to focus on the way that words are being interpreted and how the Quran should be interpreted properly is because language has natural ambiguity built into it. So we have to try to understand this. And whenever something is clear-cut linguistically, right, such that a sentence is self-evident by itself, then it should be closed to interpretation. And that's very important. So for example, if Allah says that pork, pig is forbidden for you, and then somebody comes along and says, well, the pig, actually, it's referring to a giraffe, for example, or some other animal, right? If somebody comes and says, it's not really referring to a pig, it's referring to some other thing, right? The thing is, when it comes to something like that, it's so clear-cut that there should be no room for any type of interpretation away from the actual meaning or the literal meaning of what came. But sometimes you do have ambiguity in speech. In fact, oftentimes you have ambiguity in speech, especially in pronouns, for example. So if I say, I went to the grocery store with my wife and my daughter, and in the middle of the aisle, she started grabbing the stuff from the aisles and throwing them on the floor, and she started crying. Am I referring to my daughter or my wife? You hold the daughter, but potentially there is a possibility it could be my wife as well, because the her could refer to either one. So language is ambiguous. Someone may come along and say, well, it could have been referring to the other one. There's a possibility, right? But there's a way to try to figure out from the context and by looking at the scenario and all of that. So language has a natural element of ambiguity. So the goal of the person studying Islamic law, the person studying the Quran and the Sunnah, is to figure out what the intention of the speaker or the intention of the writer, the intention of Allah and His Messenger was when they were actually mentioning this specific thing. So these interpretations, when you're trying to figure out what they actually meant in the first place, we have to make sure that they're guided by certain rules, so that you don't get far-fetched interpretations all over the place. So today we're going to cover the 8 levels that a word or a phrase can actually take on in terms of how clear it is or how ambiguous it is. So something may be super, super clear cut, and something may be super, super ambiguous. And you find this range of all levels mentioned in the Quran, and you find all the range of levels mentioned in the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So when we can identify the level of ambiguity or the level of clarity, we can actually get closer to understanding to what flexibility do we have, or what scope is there for trying to interpret this and trying to figure out what the real meaning is. So it's really important. So these are the names in this chart I put here for you. Starting from the most clear, the clearest statement is known as the definitive, and that's the muhkam. And then there is the clear, the mufassar, the explicit, the nas, the apparent, the zahir, the obscure, it's known as khafi, the difficult to understand, it's known as the mushkil, the ambiguous is mujmal, and the unclear is mutashabih. Right, so the first one is the clearest you can get, it's crystal clear, and the last one, and it keeps going down until the last one, mutashabih, is something that no one can figure out. No one can exactly know what the real meaning is. So we're going to go and we're going to look at each one of these in some level of detail. Okay, but before we do that, let's talk about the difference between explaining something and interpreting something. So many people have heard the term tafsir, right? And when I use the term tafsir in this context, it has nothing to do with the word tafsir in the context which you're familiar with. So we're not talking about tafsir of the Quran, explanation of the Quran. In this context, the word tafsir, we're talking in the field, in the realm of Islamic law only. So this is something that you have to kind of get used to. When you're studying one subject, you have to make sure that you're using the term that applies in that subject. Right? So for example, when we mention in this class the word sunnah, it's different from the word sunnah that we use in Islamic law 101 or Islamic law 102. Everyone remember that? So what did the word sunnah mean in Islamic law 101 and 102? Recommended, exactly. And what did sunnah mean in this class? What the Prophet said or did is a source of law, right? It's a source of law. So there's two different meanings. So the same thing with this tafsir, so don't get confused, okay? So one of the reasons why we have to identify a text as to how ambiguous or how clear it is so that we can determine to what extent it's open for interpretation. So any text which is clear, linguistically clear, you cannot give an interpretation to it which departs from the apparent wording that's already mentioned there in the text. But you can go ahead and explain it within the confines of the words which have already been used. So if you take a word, for example, if you take pig has been prohibited for you, for example, right? Text like that, you can sit there and you can start explaining, right? What does prohibition mean? Prohibition means you're not supposed to do it. And a pig is an animal that has, legs, and it has this, and it has that. That's an explanation. But you're not taking any of the words of the text and trying to give them a meaning other than the meaning that's already been specified. So that's what we call an explanation or a tafsir. Okay? But when there's a text which has some ambiguity in it, then you can actually interpret the words beyond the literal meaning of the text. Right? So that in order to discover what the intention of the speaker actually was in the first place. Right? So the caveat, as long as you have some evidence to do so. So for example, I'll give you an example in a moment. The words can have a primary meaning, they can have a secondary meaning, they can have a literal meaning, they can have a metaphorical meaning, they can have a technical meaning. Right? So you have to figure out what kind of meaning was intended. If the sentence is super, super clear, it's got to have that primary meaning. You can't go and say, oh, I think it's a metaphorical meaning, and vice versa. So let's take an example. If somebody comes along and says, you know what, I saw a lion today. Okay. Can the word lion be taken metaphorically? Yes, it can.
Somebody would.
Yeah, it can, because in our, young people use this all the time. Say, man, that guy's a beast. Or you know what, that politician is a monster. Does that mean he's literally a monster? It could mean that, potentially, somehow transformed into a monster, but it could also be metaphorically, in the sense that we're not referring. So when you say someone is a lion, you could actually be referring to someone is so courageous like a lion, or they're so strong like a lion. So for example, if you say, you know what, that scholar is an ocean, right? That means an ocean of knowledge, a person who has a lot of knowledge, right? So we use these terms all the time, and sometimes we don't even recognize it, we don't realize it. The thing is, when you do something like that, it means that the word lion in that sentence, I saw a lion, it's not clear. It's not 100% clear whether you're referring to a physical lion as an animal or whether you're referring to something else in this context. Right? So it could mean something this way or that way. So it could mean a metaphor, it could not mean a metaphor. But you have to justify it with evidence. You can't just randomly pick. Right? You have to have some kind of evidence. So let's take an example from the Quran. A good example from the Quran where you need to go beyond the literal meaning of the wording is the verse about wudu. When you perform wudu before prayer, right, the wording of the verse is, O believers, when you stand for prayer, wash your faces and your arms to the elbows, and the verse continues. So it says, when you stand for prayer. Now the wording is standing for prayer. Now the thing is, the actual meaning, the actual interpretation is supposed to be what? What if you don't stand up for prayer in particular? Let's say your leg is hurting, you're injured, and you can't stand up. Do you need to make wudu or you don't? You do, right? And not only that, when you stand for prayer, when do you stand for prayer? Right before you're starting your prayer. Now, if your wudu is supposed to be at that moment when you're standing for prayer, then you won't have time to make wudu. Because if you go there, you already have wudu by the time you're standing for prayer. So what does standing for prayer actually mean in this context? No, but what is the standing? Does it mean the standing means standing literally? So what does it mean? Intending, preparing or intending to pray. So the word standing means intending, even though the literal meaning of the word is standing. إِذَا قُمْتُمْ, when you stand for prayer, right? When you get up for prayer. But the actual meaning is when you intend to pray or when you get ready to pray. So what we've done is we've seen that even from the Quran, you can take a word and go beyond its literal meaning, and there's a reason. And you understand the reasoning behind it. The reasoning is because we know wudu has to be done before the prayer. And you know that you have to be, when you stand, you're about to start your prayer. So it has to have a different meaning. It can't take the meaning, the linguistic, literal meaning that's mentioned there. So this is the kind of obvious one. No one's going to argue with you and say, no, this means that you literally have to be standing and then when you make wudu or something. So this is an obvious one, so it gives you an example of how we take certain words outside of their literal linguistic connotation. So let's take a few more examples. Right? What can an interpretation do? Okay, an interpretation can do certain things like, it can take a word which has been used in a general way and specify it. Right? So one example is the verse which says, Allah has permitted trade and forbidden interest. Remember this verse? We've seen it quite a few times. Because Allah has allowed trade and forbidden interest. So when it says Allah has allowed trade, the word trade is general. And if the word is general, that would mean that Allah has allowed all types of trade, all types of business transactions, right? Any type of trade you do, the word says trade, which means it's general, so it's allowed completely. Because the verse says Allah has allowed trade. Now the word is general, but if we take the word to be general, that means any type of trade that you're doing. If you're ripping somebody off, it's trade. So therefore it's allowed, because it says in the verse, Allah has allowed trade. Obviously it can't be, right? It can't possibly mean that. And we find a bunch of hadiths, prophetic reports, which clarify, it took the word and it made that general word, it limited the scope of its meaning to make it specific. So when it says Allah has allowed trade, it doesn't mean all trade, even though the word trade was used in a general context. Because we saw in the previous class, the Prophet, peace be upon him, forbade certain types of trade. Does anyone remember what type of trades are forbidden? Selling wine, for example. You're not allowed to trade that. Okay, what else?
Something that doesn't exist.
Selling something that doesn't exist, not allowed. What else? Selling during khutbah, yes, it's not allowed. What else?
Anything you cannot specify.
Something which is not clearly specified, there's a level of uncertainty in the transaction or the product. Right? So all these type of trades are forbidden. So what happens is the general wording in this verse, which could potentially imply that all type of trade is allowed because of the wording, is now specified by other statements of the Prophet or other verses of the Quran. So that's one way an interpretation is arrived at. So remember, what does the word interpretation mean? And we're using the word ta'weed. An interpretation is to take a word and give it a different meaning from the linguistic way in which it has been used in that context. So the word trade here is general. And a general word would usually imply all trade. But we make an interpretation and say this general word was not intended to mean all. It didn't mean all. And that's very important, okay? Another thing it can do, it can restrict something which is unrestricted. So if you recall, there was a verse which talks about blood is prohibited for you. Remember that verse? And it mentions blood. Just blood by itself. Okay? That would mean if blood is prohibited, then any blood which remains inside the animal that didn't come out and you get it stuck on your steak or something is also prohibited. But there's another verse in the Quran which says that blood spilt out is prohibited. So one of the words for blood is general and the other one is restricted. One is unrestricted, it's just blood, any type of blood. And the other one, the other verse of the Quran that we saw, it specifically says blood spilled out or gushed out or came out of the animal after you slaughtered. So one word said blood and one word said blood spilled out. Which one is unrestricted? Blood is unrestricted. Which one is restricted? Blood spilled out. So what happens is this verse restricts the meaning of blood in this other verse and kind of overrides it, and that's an interpretation. In this verse it's clear. When you're reading this verse, you have to look at the word blood and say, does the word blood mean every single type or instance of blood anywhere under all conditions? The answer is no. So you've taken the word blood and you've taken it away from its literal meaning and given it a different meaning due to some other evidence. And that other evidence is the other verse which clarifies it in this case. Okay? Another example where you go away from the apparent wording and give it ta'weed or an interpretation is there's a hadith where the Prophet peace be upon him said that for every 40 sheep that you own, you have to give one sheep as zakat. If you remember from the class a long time ago, we covered zakat. We covered very briefly on animals. I put it in the appendix at the end, right? Every 40 sheep or 40 goats that you have to give one as zakat. Now, what if you decide that you would like to give the value of the sheep in cash? Are you allowed to do that or you're not allowed to do it? Okay. So we studied that we're allowed to do it. Okay. Most schools say that you're not allowed, but according to the opinion we took, you're allowed to do it And the reason is because the wording that was used, one sheep or one goat, was not intended to be taken literally. So if you took it literally, you're not allowed to give any type of cash equivalent. You have to give one sheep, it doesn't matter. If you give the same value of that sheep in cash, or in gold, or in silver, or in whatever it is, even if the person's going to benefit more. Maybe a poor person will benefit more from your cash than from having a sheep or something like that. So, in that sense, what we've done is we've looked at the wording and say, what's the real intent here? The real intent was to be helping the poor people. That's the goal behind giving this zakah. Therefore, it should be allowed outside of the wording that was used by the Prophet. If somebody says, no, the Prophet used the word sheep, you have to give a sheep. So you say, no, you make an interpretation or a ta'wil which takes the literal word, and says, this literal word was not intended to be literal for a reason. There's an evidence behind it, and the evidence is because it benefits the poor equally or greater. Another example, we talked about feeding poor people. So when you break an oath, right, one of the options is to feed how many poor people? How many? I heard it. 10 poor people, right? When you break your fast in the middle of Ramadan, 60 poor people, right? Now what the verse said is that you have to feed 60 poor people or you have to feed 10 poor people. Now the question is, can you feed one poor person 10 times? Can you feed one poor person 60 times? Right? So if we take the literal wording, the answer would be no. If we take it away from the literal wording and say, no, the intention was something different, we can expand the scope of the text. Okay, and we can say, yes, feeding one person 60 times would be allowed as well, in addition to feeding 60 people. Okay, so this is what we call ta'wil or interpretation. Right? It's very important that any interpretation that you give has to have some type of support or evidence, either in another Islamic text, another verse of the Quran, another hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, or you use an analogy or one of those things, or you apply the general principles and the spirit of the Islamic law, which is what we did in the last example. Right? It's very important. Otherwise, if you don't use these principles, then you're just making random interpretations with different words all over the place, and you can come up with anything you want. Right? So you say, well, one sheep actually meant a little toy sheep. You know, you go to Toys R Us, you buy a little toy sheep. If you have 40 sheep, you buy a little toy, and you give a little toy to the poor people for zakah. You can make up any interpretation you want. You have to have some grounding in the interpretation that you're giving. And also, the interpretation should not be some far-fetched justification of somebody's own preconceived notion of what they want this text to be. And this is very, very important because this is becoming an epidemic among many people, is that you can take a text and you say, well,